Hi folks, Sid Part 2 here, with another one-shot what if. This was generated by conversation over on our Discord, so be sure to check out the description so you can come join and jump in on all the crazy fun discussions we get up to in there. You see, we were talking about Frieza's character design and his oft-overlooked third form. Did you know it is a reference to the Alien films? One of those things that seems obvious once you know, huh? Well, Akira Toriyama is a big fan of Alien, so what if we bring the Xenomorphs into the world of Dragon Ball? Now, as always, a little bit of justification. Xenomorphs are scaled appropriately to be a threat in the world of Dragon Ball, rather than against normal humans in the Alien franchise. Also, not to give too much away, but when a Xenomorph is born from a new host, it can adopt any biological advantages of that species. Something to keep in mind as we go forward. Also, just for variety, this what if will be focused on the galaxy's most evil tyrant. You know him, you love to hate him, Freeza. So, all that being said, sit back and enjoy. The Cold Empire is vast. Its power is endless, as its kings. Yet, like any empire, it requires one thing: expansion. New worlds must be added to its territory regularly. If not, there'd be no way to sustain its many troops to satisfy its billions of inhabitants. Even the Saiyan warriors are less necessary to some missions given the number of new recruits. However, expansion has slowed. Freon, the rare resource needed to manufacture fuel for the Cold Force's many spaceships, is highly limited. The Empire is able to produce more ships than they have fuel for. Large armies of the Empire sit stagnant, waiting for shipments of fuel from the farthest reaches of the territories under Cold's control. And to make matters worse, there exists a singular planet, almost mockingly placed in an ideal location, one that would allow it to service the Empire in all directions equally. A planet which, from scans, show huge amounts of raw Freon just waiting to be taken. And yet the planet is unconquerable. Any warrior squads sent to wipe out the local inhabitants have never been heard from again. Every general King Cold has put to the task has failed. Of course, they were promptly executed for their failures, and what made it truly worse was that the population wasn't even an enemy to match wits against. No, this awful speck wouldn't even give the king that pleasure. The entire planet was swarming with disgusting, slobbering, slime-covered creatures. They were called Xenomorphs by Cold scientists. Around the 4th or 5th platoon that was sent down, one general thought up the idea of bringing some of the natives back for study, to see if a weakness could be found. There was little luck. While not overly strong, even compared to some of the mid-tier of the Cold Force's military, these creatures were perfectly adapted, almost as if engineered to survive, to kill, and to breed. While the scientists observing the captured specimen were able to discover this, it came at the cost of an entire ship. The specimen managed to escape while on board, and after abducting several crew and implanting them with its own offspring, it knocked the ship out of orbit, crashing back down to the planet. But after 10 or 12 failures, 10 or 12 executions, Cold was beginning to think this truly was a lost cause. He was getting so annoyed with the tiny rock, he'd considered just blowing it away. At least then it wouldn't be a reminder of his empire's shortcomings. Ultimately, Cold decided that it was best to leave the planet alone, for a time, in hopes new solutions would present themselves. Enter the prodigal son, Frieza. Cold's youngest son began to show remarkable power. It seemed to just burst off of him, forcing him to contain his power into a new, more reserved form that no member of the royal family had ever considered necessary. Truly, the only thing that overshadowed Frieza's literal power was his desire for power in the abstract. He never seemed happy with the commands Cold appointed to him, often excelling at the work, albeit brutally. Cold noted a sharp increase in force casualties among those appointed under his youngest's command, but there was no arguing with the results. While soldiers under Cold and Cooler were effective and well trained, soldiers under Frieza were so motivated by fear of him, they would obey without hesitation, no matter how brutal the command. Frieza was constantly vying for more, wanting to push the boundaries of the Empire ever further, wanting power, for it was all he knew. When Frieza was told that his legion would need to wait for fuel before going forward, he instantly killed the commander who informed him. For Frieza, this was not good enough. He wanted to keep pushing and told his father that there must be something they could do. Cold considered his son's ambition. It exceeded his own, there was no doubt of that. Perhaps it was time as a father to give his son a lesson in limitations. Despite his best general's efforts, no one was able to conquer the rock with the Xenomorphs on it. Perhaps putting the task in front of Frieza would teach the boy what it means to accept harsh realities. Cold explained the history of the Force's encounters with that planet, and the vast opportunity it presented should Frieza conquer it. But he was also very stern in warning Frieza that to destroy this planet would be nothing short of a monumental failure. Cold would rather control the space around it and hold on to it as a future opportunity than have something so potentially valuable lost because of his son's temper. As soon as Frieza was alone with the task in front of him, he smirked at his father's concern. It was a lone planet. He'd conquered more in mere hours. Like all other things put before him, this would be no challenge. Frieza's first idea was to send a large platoon down. Certain that they were likely to perish, he had their scouters transmit back visuals and data. However, upon landing, it seemed the planet was dormant. The Cold Force soldiers moved ahead cautiously. Suddenly, one of their scouters spiked and pointed to a faint power source on the ground. Its soldier confused, since he wasn't airborne. There should be no power level below him. But then he felt a large claw grab his ankle, and as he looked down, he saw a sickly black arm was emerging from the very ground itself and pulling him into a fold in the terrain. He screamed as it was all happening so quickly he had no idea what to do to stop it. The same quickly happened to the other squad members. Frieza watched his ship's monitors closely until the screaming of his men ended, and they were dragged into the darkness of the nests the Xenomorphs had carved into the planet's entire surface.
Well, it seems Father wasn't exaggerating after all. No matter. Ensure that all future squads fly to bring out the pests.
And so they did, but those soldiers were also taken out. Massive swarms of flying mutations of the creatures bombarded the flying soldiers and tackled them to the ground in mere instants. Once there, now that the planet-wide nest was no longer dormant, they were quickly pulled under into the folds of the nest by thousands of powerful, claw-like hands. Any one of the Cold Force's low-tier soldiers was likely more than a match for at least 10 Xenomorphs. But the sheer numbers present were completely overwhelming. That was something Frieza refused to accept. He blamed his men. In the mere hours he'd expected to set aside for this rock, he'd completely drained his reserves. He was left with crew, not soldiers. And out of frustration, Frieza sent them down to the miserable rock, all but one pilot and a communications expert. Realizing he had underestimated the threat of these Xenomorphs, Frieza decided to call in the most elite force in his command, recently gifted to him as a birthday present. While the Ginu Force answered only to his father, and Cooler had his armored squadron, Frieza was in charge of a small squad of elite soldiers with power levels all over 10,000. Frieza had his communications expert call in the Niku squad. The three soldiers of the Niku squad were Corp, Gyu, and their leader, Deli. They came rushing in as soon as the call from Frieza came through. Deli organized their landings to 3 different points on the planet. He left his pod while still in the upper atmosphere over the northern hemisphere. The flying variants of the Xenomorphs couldn't touch him there. He began to fire large blasts down to the planet's surface, making sure to limit himself so as not to damage the planet too badly. Gyu, being a true brute, landed in the western region of the planet and remained in his pod for quite some time, letting the creatures surround and claw at it, before he erupted in a powerful blast, killing everything around for at least a mile. With his pod destroyed in the blast too, he began to march forward, charging up his energy again, planning to erupt over and over until there was nothing left to destroy. Corp landed in the southern pole. He ballooned himself to an outrageous proportion and began to stomp and blast his way around the land, crushing the creatures beneath his massive boots and burning up the swarms of flying beasts for miles around. Frieza began to feel pleased with the progress of the Niku squad as they circled the planet. Mere hours were not enough, he realized. With only 3 soldiers, it may take a few days to eliminate these pests, but that would still be acceptable for such a prize. Deli's plan was quite genius. The Niku squad was having fantastic success killing Xenomorphs by the thousands for hours. Unfortunately, his intelligence on the creatures was limited. Corpse stomping about in the south would be their undoing. The material in his boots that allowed them to change size with him was already being pushed to its limits. The acidic blood of the Xenomorphs he was crushing began to work its way through. Once his feet were exposed, the blood ate through his skin and exposed bone in seconds. The giant fell to the ground and was quickly overrun by Xenomorphs. He pleaded for help. Deli flew across the planet as quickly as he could. Once he saw his ally and friend on the ground, overrun by the creatures, he forgot the plan entirely and flew lower to the ground. There he was tackled down by the flying mutations. Both soldiers were dragged deep into the nest, trying to blast the beasts away madly, but getting covered in sprays of acid and hurting their bodies worse in the process. Only Gyu was left on the planet. His consistent eruptions had managed to damage his scouter, and so he had no communication with the other members of his team. But he was following Deli's plan, moving in a straight line where he and Deli were meant to converge so that they could both have some time to recover their stamina while watching each other's backs. By the time he arrived at the rendezvous, Gyu was in desperate need of a breather, having drained most of his energy. However, Deli was nowhere to be seen. Gyu didn't panic at first, but it set in quickly. Gyu kept having to erupt over and over, each time affecting smaller and smaller areas, buying him less and less time. First a few minutes, then a minute, then less. The creatures were endless, a writhing black ocean of hissing monsters. He finally collapsed, drained of energy. Unable to fight, he was dragged deep into the planet-wide nest. There he was held up as the Xenomorphs began to coat him in a cold slime they secreted from the inner mouth, binding him to the wall of the hive. A large egg-like sack was then placed in front of him. Gyu looked around the nest, unsure why he was still alive. Then he saw other soldiers from Frieza's army. They were all strung up just like him, an egg laying in front of them. But the difference was, theirs appeared open. They had a strange, spider-like creature clutching their faces. Suddenly he heard a loud scream from far away in the nest. A bone-crunching pop could be heard. At first it seemed like an echo, but the tone was too different. It was another scream, followed by the same pop. A chorus began, one after another, and as Gyu looked off in the direction of the screams, his heart began to race. Soon he saw those screaming as it spread to the others in the same chamber as him. He saw small white xenomorphs burst from the chests of the other soldiers, each one growing closer and closer to him. When the nearest began to scream uncontrollably, Gyu turned away, unable to look. But the only other thing in the birthing chamber to see was the egg placed in front of him, as it began to open. Freeza was starting to grow anxious. He hadn't been updated by the Niku squad in hours. He demanded the communications officer to get a report. They quickly informed Frieza that there was no word from any of the Niku squad members.
I see. Update the ship log. Adjust our company. Down to 2.
So sorry, sir, but there's still, 3 of us, including yourself. The ship company would have been reduced to 1 if the pilot had been in the same room for his next move. Frieza burst through the viewport of his quarters and began to fly directly at the planet that had so vexed him. Frieza raised his hand far above his head and charged a gigantic ball of energy, burning only half as hot as his temper. Frieza looked at this rock with fury as he prepared to wipe it from his galaxy. Freon be damned, he would find more somewhere else. He could force new worlds to produce more, no matter the cost. His father could learn to live without this irksome rock and these disgusting creatures. These insects would never trouble him again. But just as he prepared to wipe the Xenomorphs from existence, King Cold's words rang in Frieza's mind. To destroy this planet would be a failure, and Frieza would never accept that. Failure was worse than any annoyance to him. If his men had failed, if his elites had failed, then there was only one option remaining: to succeed himself. Frieza pulled the energy of the planet killer back and flew to the surface of this pitiful world. Much like Gyu had done, Frieza erupted in explosions for hours, wiping out hundreds of Xenomorphs every time. After all, Deli's plan did show promise, it just had a flaw. But Frieza didn't have to worry about growing tired. He had never exerted himself before, even when playing with Cooler. Releasing energy was nothing to him. He could do this for days without growing tired. But he quickly became bored. And while it was satisfying to see hundreds of these insects die at a time, it lacked the personal touch that Frieza had found he enjoyed. So he began to unload some of that fury in a more intimate fashion, starting to blast away with but a finger, sweeping his arm wide across the sea of writhing beasts. Frieza made a game of it, spinning in circles faster and faster, shooting beams wildly in order to keep them away. Even this began to grow tiresome for the young tyrant. He started to slow, allowing them to inch closer, just for the thrill of seeing them drop at his feet. This playful attitude, however, would prove unwise, as one of the Xenomorphs lunged through the air at Frieza. Of course, he was never in any danger. Frieza was able to react in plenty of time and shoot a pink beam right through the creature's head, which exploded on impact, showering Frieza in its blood. At first, Frieza laughed at the feeling, but the laughter quickly faded as the bubbling burn of the Xenomorph's acidic blood started to eat away at Frieza's skin. However, he was not injured. Frieza's body was overflowing with energy. He quickly, almost without thought, was able to atomize the acid on his body. But the severity of the harm had nothing to do with it. He was the son of this galaxy's king. He was destined for greatness, and these disgusting insects had managed to harm him in a most disgusting manner at that. However slight it may have been, it could not be permitted. Whatever anger Frieza had managed to work off was now renewed. He decided to start taking matters seriously. He erupted in another massive blast and bought himself a few minutes. He used this time to transform. Assuming the form his father had created, Frieza decided to quickly deal with these insects. Now he could make blasts for miles if he had to. It didn't matter if there were 1,000,000 of the insects left or billions. They had to end eventually. And in this form, Frieza's energy would not. It didn't matter how boring it got. He would blast away for days if necessary. Frieza began to fly low, and planned to simply blast in front of him until there was nothing left to kill. And that plan might have worked too, if he had done it when his ship first arrived on the planet. But Frieza had been feeding the hive, feeding it all kinds of strange new aliens from all over the galaxy. Aliens with unique biological quirks and raw power unlike anything the hive had encountered before. As Frieza flew along the surface, he was blindsided by a new variant of Xenomorph. One with large horns, not dissimilar to his own in this second form, but truly, they were more like Gyu's. Because of course it was from his genes that this mutation was born. Its initial assault took Frieza by surprise and knocked him back a bit. Hundreds of Xenomorphs tried to claw and grab him, but he easily shrugged them off. This new horned Xenomorph, however, began to charge forward at Frieza, horns pointed down to gore. Frieza, however, simply shot a blast down at the ground, forcing the mutation high into the air. He prepared to shoot it before it hit the ground, but was blasted from the back. Frieza turned to see yet another mutation, this one a dark yellow hue, its inner mouth steaming from the massive energy blast it had just manifested. Deli's genes had paid off well, granting the Hive access to abilities no other species they'd violated had before. The Horned Xenomorph also began to shoot energy beams at Frieza, the two mutations working in unison. Though he couldn't tell, as Frieza had no scouter, these mutations were able to manifest energy much higher than either of the father bodies. The Xenomorph's unique biology, both adapting and amplifying any trait its host bodies had that the Xenomorph did not. When they encountered better immune systems, the Hive grew more resilient. When they clashed with raw muscle, the Hive grew stronger. When brilliance was innate in their hosts, the Hive grew more resourceful.
Bravo! For a primitive race of insects, your ingenuity is truly astounding. Unfortunately, once I crush these two, there'll be nothing left to stop me exterminating the lot of you. Even beasts should know to cower in the presence of their master. Deli and Gyu's power is nothing compared to me in this form, even
Suddenly, the ground beneath Frieza burst open as a gigantic Xenomorph shot up and swallowed Frieza in its inner mouth. The most significant mutation by far was this one, derived from corpse genes. His innate ability to grow to outrageous proportions was like a gift to the Xenomorph's biological makeup. The Hive's natural tendency to corner and ambush, coupled with a massive creature like this, made for the perfect trap to spring on Frieza, who couldn't sense such a power just below the surface. However, this gambit failed to succeed. While Frieza had been swallowed by the beast, he was still far from helpless, and finally his outrage at these disgusting insects reached a breaking point. He formed a saw blade of energy and cut straight through the pair of throats surrounding him, getting completely soaked in the highly acidic blood of the Xenomorphs for a second time. Now the acid was actually beginning to sting. Frieza fumed in the air as the creatures began to swarm around him. He had grown tired of their disgusting noises, of the sight of their slime-coated skin. But worst of all, worse even than this humiliation they had forced him to feel, was the sense of failure building up around him. And it was in that moment that it all clicked for Frieza. Failure was the point. His father had grown tired of Frieza's constant success, of his lack of acquiescence to the circumstances of any given situation. Cold had presented this task because he had accepted it was not possible. This planet was a lost cause. And while his father had allowed the rock to sit as a symbol of failure, a so-called lesson, Frieza still refused. He was not his father. Deep down, Frieza knew he was always better than everyone in the universe. That he was meant to rule it. Frieza was meant to be emperor, no one else. And if he had to prove it to this writhing mass of insects first, then so be it. The Xenomorphs had always served a mother queen, one who bore them and continued their lineage without end. But now they were about to learn what it meant to scorn a king. Frieza had a plan, a way to wipe out the lot of them without wasting any more time. He had been doing things too much like his father, sending in endless lackeys, even going so far as to use Cold's form. No longer. Frieza was going to be more hands-on, and for what he had planned, he needed more control over his power. But there was no way to do that as things stood. His first form, too weak to output the energy needed. This second, not controlled enough to be as precise as he required. And his final form, far too raw in power for either. It was time for a new form, a third transformation that could control the power of his father's form, but allow for the delicacy of his first.
Inspiration truly is a fickle mistress to strike me in a situation such as this. I suppose bloodbaths really are my preferred muse. So, I shall gift you a final tribute. Something to remember you by. Be honored, for what small amount of terror your visage has inspired shall be magnified 100-fold, once it is enhanced by the powers of the mighty Frieza.
Frieza focused his energy and pictured the creatures in his mind, crafting the shape his body would take as he allowed more of his energy to expand about, forming shapes which he made flesh. An act of transformation that caused Frieza more physical pain than the Xenomorphs could ever hope to. Suddenly, floating among the swarms of Xenomorphs was a white and purple creature, one who gave the hive pause. It seemed so similar to the rest of them. For a brief moment, they hesitated.
Ah, there it is. What a relief to confirm that no matter how primitive the species, they all have the same glimmer of fear in their eyes. It can be rude to stare, but don't fret. Your king will allow it.
Frieza raised his hand high into the air and formed a giant ball of energy, enough to kill the entire planet. And this time, he released it, letting it dig deep into the ground. But once it was halfway down, he pushed it quickly forward. The sphere shot off toward the horizon, never exiting the ground as it stayed level and rapidly moved across the planet's surface, absorbing every xenomorph in its path and scorching them away into nothing. Frieza pushed the death ball around the planet time and again, shaving a few miles off its surface and eliminating everything in its wake, yet leaving the majority of the planet intact.
Pest-free.
Once the task was done, Frieza returned to his ship and retrieved a scouter. He then began to search the planet for any remaining signs of life, and got one reading. Deep in a hive birthing chamber, Frieza found the Mother Queen, protected far beneath the planet's surface from his attack. She barely clung to life. Frieza smiled and held up 2 fingers on each hand. The first blast was practical, severing the egg sacs so no more of these insects could be produced. But when Frieza saw the pain this caused, he couldn't resist. He released a barrage of the blasts at his weakest possible power, just to torture the Queen, giving her nothing but pain till her last breath. All that was left was a single egg. Quickly deducing that this must be what they used to breed, he prepared to destroy it. But a different thought crossed his mind. As disgusting as these insects were, there could still be a use for them in the Frieza Force someday. And that's it, folks. I hope you enjoyed this very odd but hopefully fun story, and who knows, maybe if there's enough demand we could do a sequel to it. Hell, get Toriyama to watch it and I'll do a sequel in no time flat. I've been Sid Part 2. You can go check out my channel, linked in the description.
Also want to give a shout out to the one and only Mr. Air Fusion for coming on to voice Frieza, the host of Dragon Ball Dissection. It was a great opportunity to work with them. So please, if you haven't checked out that series, go over to their channel, link in the description. Until next time, have fun, geeks.